If someone had told me that my entire world would pivot on a worn olive green jacket, I would have laughed. My world didn't pivot. It was a quiet, predictable orbit around a fixed point of solitude. Books. The scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the slivers of afternoon light that pierced the library stacks. The low hum of the fluorescent lights in my architecturally uninspired dorm room. The precise arrangement of my pencils on my desk. These were the constants, the gravitational forces that kept my life in a neat, manageable loop. Then there was Julian. Julian was not a constant. He was a meteor, a loud, bright, chaotic force that had crashed into my orbit when the university housing lottery had, in its infinite and cruel wisdom, deemed us compatible roommates. He was the captain of the rugby team, a fact I knew not because he told me, but because his entire existence seemed to scream it. He was a landscape of broad shoulders and solid muscle, built with an unapologetic density that seemed to take up more than his physical share of our cramped apartment. He moved with a thoughtless grace that infuriated me, an easy confidence that suggested the world was a thing to be conquered, not a place to be carefully navigated. His side of the apartment was a testament to this philosophy. A controlled explosion of discarded jerseys, monstrously large sneakers that smelled of mud and sweat, and textbooks left open to pages he would likely never read. He was a whirlwind of social energy. Laughter and loud music bled from under his door at all hours, the sound of a life being lived fully, a life I only observed from the quiet harbor of my own room. We existed in a state of carefully maintained distance, a choreography of avoidance. I would wait until I heard his shower turn off before I used the kitchen. He would grunt a "hey" as he passed me in the hall, his eyes already on his phone, already somewhere else. We were two different species forced into the same small terrarium, each respecting an invisible, shimmering barrier that separated our territories. For me, that barrier was made of fear. It was a quiet, suffocating kind of fear that lived in my chest, a frantic bird beating its wings against my ribs whenever he was near. Because from the safety of my side of the apartment, through the crack in my door, I watched him. I studied him the way I studied poetry, searching for meter and meaning in the line of his jaw, the casual way he ran a hand through his dark, unruly hair. He was beautiful. It was a stupid, pointless, dangerous fact, a fact I kept locked away in the most fortified part of my heart. He was a sun, and I knew that if I got too close, my carefully constructed world of paper and quiet would simply incinerate. So I kept my distance. I orbited. I observed. My life was a straight line, predictable, safe. Julian was the wild, terrifying variable I did my best to ignore. Until the night the universe decided to stop ignoring me. The disruption began, as most disruptions do, with something small, the weather. A sudden, vicious cold front had descended upon the campus, a bite of premature winter that no one was prepared for. The sky was the color of a bruise, and a wind sharp as glass rattled the window panes of our apartment. I was curled on my threadbare armchair, a book open in my lap, a mug of tea warming my hands. This was my sanctuary, my routine, the predictable comfort of a Tuesday night. Then a knock on my door. It was so out of character that for a moment I was sure I had imagined it. Julian did not knock. He yelled from the hallway, or simply materialized in the living room like a force of nature. A knock was polite. It was hesitant. It was not Julian. I waited, my heart suddenly a frantic drum against my ribs. The knock came again, harder this time. "Lau, you in there?" His voice, muffled through the cheap wood of the door, but unmistakably his. Deep, a little rough around the edges. I closed my eyes, took a breath that did nothing to calm the frantic bird in my chest, and stood up. My sock feet made no sound on the floor as I crossed the room and turned the knob. He stood there, filling the doorway. He was already dressed to go out, dark jeans, a thin gray shirt that did little to hide the solid lines of his chest and arms. His hair was damp, freshly showered, and the air around him smelled of soap and a specific, musky scent that always seemed to linger in the apartment long after he was gone. It was a scent I tried very hard not to notice. "Hey," he said, and he looked awkward. It was an expression so foreign on his features that it was like seeing a statue frown. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting around my room, taking in the neat stacks of books, the clean surfaces, the quiet order of my life. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness, as if my very soul were on display and had been found wanting. I managed, my voice a dry whisper. He cleared his throat, jamming his hands into his pockets. So, weird question. I waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the wind howling outside and the frantic, silent beating of my own heart. I can't find my jacket, he said, finally meeting my eyes. His were a startling shade of hazel, flecked with green and gold, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. The black one. I think I left it at practice or something. And it's freezing out there. I just stared at him. This was the most we had spoken in a month. And it was about a jacket. It was so mundane, so normal, it felt surreal. Right, I said, because I couldn't think of anything else. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, so, look, this is going to sound stupid, but could I maybe borrow one of yours? Just for tonight. I'll get it back to you tomorrow, clean and everything. My jackets. I thought of the small collection hanging in my closet, the thin windbreaker, the formal blazer I wore for presentations, and the green one, my favorite, a soft, slightly oversized field jacket made of worn cotton, with a fleece lining that was frayed to the cuffs. It was my comfort object, my shield against the world. It smelled like me, like my laundry detergent, like old books, like the faint, lingering scent of the tea I was always drinking. The idea of Julian wearing it, it was a violation, a crossing of a boundary so profound I couldn't even articulate it. Him, inside my jacket, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric, his skin against the fleece lining. The thought sent a jolt through me, a strange mix of panic and a darker, more treacherous feeling. A thrill. I don't know if they'd fit you, I stammered, the excuse flimsy even to my own ears. He shrugged, a movement that rippled through his shoulders. Anything's better than this. He gestured to his thin shirt. I'll be careful with it. Promise. There was a plea in his eyes, a genuine, unguarded request. And I was at my core a coward. I was incapable of saying no. Incapable of the kind of casual rejection that people like Julian probably dealt with and dished out every single day. So I turned, my movements stiff and robotic, and walked to my closet. I pushed aside the other hangers until my fingers found the familiar, soft fabric of the green jacket. I pulled it out. It felt like I was handing over a piece of my own skin. I held it out to him. He took it, and for a bare, fleeting second, his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, an accident, a spark of static electricity, but it felt like a brand, a searing heat that shot up my arm and straight into my chest, where the bird was now trying to claw its way out. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. He didn't seem to notice. He was already shrugging the jacket on. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the fabric strained across his back. The sleeves were a little too short, ending just above his wrists, but fit him better than I had expected. Better than it had any right to. He zipped it up, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He looked down at himself, then back at me. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something devastating. Perfect, he said. You're a lifesaver, Leo. Seriously. And then he was gone. I stood in my doorway, staring at the empty hall, my hand still tingling where he had touched it. The air where he had stood was still warm, still smelled of his soap. I could hear his heavy footsteps thudding down the stairs, the front door of the building opening and then slamming shut, swallowed by the wail of the wind. I closed my door and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. My quiet, predictable orbit had been breached. The meteor had not just crashed into my atmosphere. It was now wearing my clothes. And I had the terrible, sinking feeling that my world, the safe, small world I had so carefully constructed, would never be the same. The apartment was too quiet after he left. The silence he left in his wake was different from my usual, comfortable solitude. This was a hollow silence, an absence. I walked back to my chair, but my book held no interest. The words on the page were just black marks, meaningless. My tea had gone cold. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind against the glass, made me jump. I kept thinking I heard him coming back. I imagined 100 scenarios. He'd forgotten his keys. He'd changed his mind. He'd realized what a colossal mistake he'd made in asking me, the quiet, weird roommate, for a favor. I went to bed early, but couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a frantic, looping reel. Julian, in my jacket, out in the world somewhere. At a party, probably. Surrounded by people. Laughing. Maybe some girl would lean against him, her hand resting on the sleeve of my jacket. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, ugly twist of jealousy in my gut. It was absurd. It was my jacket, not my life. But in that moment, they felt inextricably linked. He had taken a piece of my quiet world out into his loud one, and I felt exposed. Raw. I finally fell into a restless sleep and woke hours later to the sound of the front door opening. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I glanced at my clock. 3 a.m. I heard him moving around in the living room. A heavy sigh, the clink of a glass being set down on the coffee table. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. I want to know if he was alone. I want to know if he'd brought someone back with him. The thought made my stomach clench. But there were no other voices. Just the sound of his quiet, solitary movements. The soft creak of the floorboards as he walked down the hall. His bedroom door closing with a soft click. And then, silence again. The hollow silence. The next morning, the jacket was lying on the armchair in the living room. It was neatly folded, a gesture so uncharacteristically tidy for him that it felt like a statement. An apology, maybe, or a final closing of a door that had been briefly, accidentally, opened. I picked it up. The fabric was cold from the night air, but it held a new scent. Underneath the familiar smell of my laundry detergent, there was something else. The faint, smoky aroma of a bar, the sharp tang of something alcoholic, and underneath it all, the undeniable, warm, musky scent of Julian's skin. I brought it to my face and inhaled, my eyes closing. It was an act of pure, masochistic folly. It was like breathing him in. The intimacy of it made me dizzy. I felt like a thief stealing this small, sensory piece of his night, of his life. I took the jacket back to my room and hung it in my closet, pushing it to the very back, as if hiding a piece of evidence. But I couldn't hide the memory. The scent of him clung not just to the fabric, but to the air in my room, to the inside of my head. The barrier between our worlds had been more than breached. It had been contaminated. Things were different after that. Or maybe they were the same, but I was different. I noticed things I hadn't before. I noticed the way Julian's shoulders slumped when he came home from a late practice, the confidence draining out of him to reveal a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I saw the dark circles under his eyes during midterm week, the way he'd rub his temples as he stared blankly at a textbook, his jaw tight with stress. He was not just a meteor. He was a planet, with his own pressures, his own unseen geology. He had moments of frustration, of weariness. He wasn't just the loud, effortless force of nature I had painted him as. He was human. This new knowledge was dangerous. It made him approachable. It made the frantic bird in my chest beat its wings with a terrifying, hopeful rhythm. A week later, the real thaw began. I was in the kitchen, making toast, when he stumbled out of his room, looking pale and unsteady. He was wearing sweatpants and a rumpled t-shirt, his hair a mess. He squinted against the morning light as if it physically pained him. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick and gravelly. "Are you okay?" The question was out of my mouth before I could stop it. It was a breach of our unspoken contract of mutual indifference. He shook his head, leaning against the doorframe. Feel like I got hit by a truck. I got a proper look at him then. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy. He was shivering slightly, despite the warmth of the apartment. "You look sick," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Yeah," he croaked. "I think I am." He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to shake his whole frame. He swayed on his feet, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to collapse. I moved without thinking. I crossed the small kitchen space and put a hand on his arm to steady him. Whoa, easy. His skin was on fire. The heat radiated through his t-shirt, a dry, feverish warmth that was alarming. His arm was solid muscle under my hand, hard as a rock, but there was a tremor running through it. He looked down at my hand on his arm, and his hazel eyes seemed unfocused, confused. This was the first time I had touched him intentionally. My fingers were spread against the worn cotton of his shirt, feeling the heat and the faint vibration of his shivering. My thumb rested on the bare skin of his bicep. It was an electrifying connection. My entire nervous system lit up. "You need to get back to bed," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. He nodded weakly, allowing me to guide him back to his room. It was the first time I had ever been inside. It was exactly as chaotic as I'd imagined, but now, instead of feeling alien, it just felt lived in. A rugby poster was taped to the wall. A guitar was propped in the corner. It was a map of a person I didn't know at all. I helped him into his bed, a tangle of gray sheets and a heavy duvet. He collapsed onto the mattress with a groan, pulling the covers up to his chin. "Thanks," he whispered, his eyes already closing. I stood there for a moment, in the middle of his messy, intensely personal space. The dynamic between us had just been completely inverted. The strong, self-sufficient athlete was now helpless, and I, the quiet, invisible observer, was suddenly the caregiver. The power had shifted. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady. I spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet panic and strange purpose. I made him soup, which he barely touched. I went to the campus pharmacy and bought fever reducers and throat lozenges. I left glasses of water by his bed. I would knock softly on his door, and he would mumble for me to come in. I would enter his fever-hot room, check on him, and leave as quickly as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. He was mostly asleep, lost in a feverish haze, but there were moments of lucidity. Once, as I was placing a new glass of water on his nightstand, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Leo," he rasped, his eyes cracked open. They were cloudy, but they were focused on me. "You don't have to do this." "It's fine," I said quickly, trying to pull my wrist away, but he held on. His thumb drew a slow, hot circle on the sensitive skin of my inner wrist. My breath hitched. "No, it's nice," he said, his voice a low murmur. "No one's taken care of me in a long time." His eyes fluttered closed again, his hand went limp, and he was asleep. But I stood there for a full minute, frozen, the ghost of his touch burning on my skin. A vulnerability had been exposed. Not just his, but mine. He had seen a part of me I kept hidden, the part that cared, the part that was capable of tenderness. And he hadn't recoiled. He had called it nice. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing that had ever happened to me. The storm that finally broke everything came 2 nights later. It wasn't a meteorological storm, but a quiet, internal one that had been brewing between us in the charged silence of the apartment. Julian was better. The fever had broken, and the color had returned to his face. He was still weak, confined to the apartment on team doctor's orders, but he was lucid. He was present, and his presence was a heavy, palpable thing that filled every room. We had fallen into a new, tentative routine. I'd make extra food and leave a plate for him. He'd emerge from his room, and we'd eat in the living room, not quite in silence, but not quite in conversation either. We'd make small talk about classes, about the weather. It was stilted and awkward, a dance around the elephant in the room, the fact that I had seen him at his most vulnerable, and neither of us knew what to do with that knowledge. That night, the power went out. One moment, the room was bathed in the warm, artificial glow of the lamps. The next, we were plunged into an absolute, disorienting darkness. I heard Julian curse softly from the couch. The hum of the refrigerator died. The entire building fell into a sudden, profound silence. "Great," he said into the blackness. His voice sounded closer than I expected. Just what I needed. "I have a candle," I said, my own voice sounding small and thin. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The darkness was a blanket, a shield. In the dark, you didn't have to worry about facial expressions, about meeting someone's eyes. It was a level playing field. I fumbled my way to my room, my hands tracing the familiar path along the wall. I found a thick vanilla-scented candle on my bookshelf and my lighter. When I returned to the living room, the flame I sparked to life felt like a miniature sun. It pushed back the oppressive darkness, but only just. It cast our small living room in a flickering, intimate glow. The shadows it threw were long and deep, transforming the familiar space into something new and strange. I set the candle on the coffee table between us. Julian was sitting on the couch, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. The candlelight carved his face out of the darkness, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the shadows under his cheekbones. He looked older, more serious. "Thanks," he said, his eyes fixed on the flame. We sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't the awkward silence of the past few days. It was a comfortable, weighted silence, the kind of quiet that allows for thought. "You know," he said, his voice low, "this is the quietest it's been in here since I moved in." I gave a small, nervous laugh. "I know. I'm usually the one making it quiet." He looked at me then, his hazel eyes seeming to glow in the candlelight. "I was an idiot," he said, and the words were so unexpected they stole the air from my lungs. "What?" "When I first moved in," he clarified, not looking away. "I thought you were, I don't know, stuck up, judgmental, always in your room with your books. I thought you hated me." My heart was doing a slow, heavy thud in my chest. "I didn't hate you. I know that now," he said. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "These last few days, you've taken care of me. No one's ever. My parents are always busy. On the team, you can't show weakness. You just tape it up and play through it. I'm not used to someone just being kind." The confession hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. He had just handed me a piece of his loneliness, a piece of the insecurity he hid so well behind his easy confidence. And in that moment, in the strange, magical intimacy of the candlelit darkness, I felt a surge of bravery I had never known. The words came from a place deep inside me, a place I had kept locked and guarded for years. "I was scared of you," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. His brow furrowed. "Scared? Of me? What?" And there it was. The precipice. I could step back, make a joke, change the subject. Or I could jump. I jumped. "Because you're everything I'm not," I said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "You're loud and confident, and everyone loves you. You walk into a room, and you own it." I just disappear into the corners. I took a shaky breath. "And because I liked you." And that was terrifying. The last 3 words landed in the silence with the weight of stones. I couldn't believe I'd said them. I wanted to snatch them back out of the air. I braced myself for the laugh, for the awkward rejection, for the sudden, cold distance to slam back down between us, harder and more permanent than ever. But Julian just watched me, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. The silence stretched on, a taut wire of tension. My entire future seemed to be balanced on it. Then he moved. He uncoiled from the couch and shifted, closing the small distance between us. He sat on the floor in front of my armchair, so close our knees were almost touching. The heat coming off him was a palpable force. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a second before he gently, hesitantly, cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of pure lightning that shot through every nerve in my body. "You don't disappear," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his hand into my skin. "I always saw you. I just didn't know how to talk to you." He let out a shaky breath. "That night, when I borrowed your jacket, it smelled like you, like paper and tea and quiet. I fell asleep in it when I got home." My world tilted on its axis. The frantic bird in my chest was suddenly, impossibly still. All I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. All I could feel was the warm, calloused rough skin of his thumb against my cheek. He leaned in closer, his eyes searching mine, asking a question I was terrified and desperate to answer. The space between our lips dwindled until it was nothing. His kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't forceful or demanding. It was slow, hesitant, a soft, questioning pressure. It was a confession in itself. It tasted of uncertainty and a deep, surprising tenderness. I leaned into it, my eyes fluttering shut, my hand coming up to rest on his chest. I could feel his heart hammering against my palm, a frantic rhythm that matched my own. The world narrowed to this single point of contact. The scent of vanilla from the candle, the warmth of his skin, the soft pressure of his lips on mine. It was the end of my orbit. It was the beginning of everything. The morning after was brutal. I woke up alone. My first sensation was the cold air on my skin, where Julian's body had been pressed against mine. We had fallen asleep on the couch, tangled together in the aftermath of that hesitant, world-altering kiss. But now he was gone. The power was back on. The harsh, unforgiving light of dawn streamed through the window, illuminating the living room in stark detail. The candle on the coffee table was a cold, waxy monument to the night before. The intimacy of the darkness had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, awkward reality. My heart, which had felt so full and steady just hours ago, was now a leaden weight in my chest. A familiar, sickening anxiety began to creep in, its cold tendrils wrapping around my lungs. He regrets it. The thought was a sharp, physical pain. It was a moment of weakness, a fluke born of darkness and strange confessions. He was sick, he was lonely, and I was there. I was a convenience. I got up from the couch, my body stiff and sore. I walked to his bedroom door. It was closed. I listened, my ear pressed against the wood, and heard nothing. A quick check of the shoe rack by the front door confirmed it. His huge running shoes were gone. He'd left for an early practice. Without a word, without note, without even a backward glance. The silence he left behind was the worst yet. It was no longer a hollow absence. It was a screaming void. Every object in the room, the couch, the candle, the very air itself, seemed to mock me, reminding me of what I had been stupid enough to believe, for a few short hours, was real. I retreated to my room, the one safe place I had, but it offered no comfort. It felt like a cage. My solitude, once a source of peace, was now a punishment. It was tainted by the memory of not being alone. I went through the motions of my day in a fog. I went to the library, but I couldn't read. The words blurred on the page, each sentence twisting itself into a new form of self-recrimination. You overstepped. You misread everything. You are a fool. I skipped my classes. I couldn't face the thought of seeing anyone, of having to pretend that my world hadn't just imploded. I returned to the apartment in the crushing silence. He didn't come back that afternoon. He didn't come back that evening. With every passing hour, the anxiety grew, hardening into a bitter certainty. He was avoiding me. He was figuring out how to let me down easy, how to say, "Look, man, last night was weird. Let's just forget it happened." Or worse, he wouldn't say anything at all. He would just retreat back behind the shimmering wall of indifference, and we would go back to being strangers who shared a bathroom. Only now it would be poisoned with the memory of what we had done. I imagined him telling his teammates. A joke in the locker room. The story of the weird, quiet roommate who had a crush on him. My stomach churned. I felt sick. By the second day of his absence, I had rebuilt all my walls, brick by painful brick. I had convinced myself it was for the best. The kiss was an anomaly, a beautiful, terrifying glitch in the system. Now, things would return to normal. I would go back to my quiet orbit. It was safer there. I had been a fool to ever want to leave it. The loneliness was a familiar ache, far more bearable than the sharp, fresh wound of rejection. He was a meteor. Meteors don't stop to build a life. They just burn bright and disappear. I had been caught in his momentary glow, and now I was left in the dark, scorched. I was lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to feel nothing when I heard his key in the lock. It was late, past midnight. My body went rigid. Every muscle tensed. This was it. The confrontation. The awkward conversation. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. I heard the door open and close. The sound of his gym bag hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Footsteps in the hall. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. A soft knock. Now. His voice was low, tired. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight with unshed tears, with 1,000 things I wanted to scream at him. Leo, I know you're in there, he said, his voice closer now, as if he were leaning against the door. Please, can we talk? I remained silent. A part of me, the wounded, angry part, wanted to make him suffer in this silence, just as I had for 2 days. I'm an idiot, he said, his voice cracking on the last word. I'm a coward, and I'm sorry. That broke me. A small, choked sound escaped my lips. The doorknob turned. He slowly pushed the door open. My room was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. He stood in the doorway, a large, dark silhouette. He looked exhausted, defeated. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, shutting the rest of the world out. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there, a few feet from my bed. I panicked, he said, his voice barely a whisper in the dark. I woke up that morning, and you were asleep, and it was perfect, too perfect, and it scared the hell out of me. He took a step closer. I've never felt that way. About anyone, let alone a guy. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what to do. All I could think about was my team, my dad, all the noise. So I ran. I went to practice, and I hit things, and I tried to pretend it didn't happen. I sat up slowly, my heart a painful, hopeful drum against my ribs. It didn't work, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Everywhere I went, all I could think about was you. All I could think about was getting back here. But I was afraid that I'd ruined it, that you'd hate me for leaving like that. He finally looked at me, and even in the dim light, I could see the raw vulnerability in his eyes. The confident athlete was gone. This was just Julian, scared and confused, and so painfully honest it hurt to look at him. I don't hate you, I whispered. A shuddering breath escaped him. He crossed the remaining distance between us and sat on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped with his weight. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently took mine. His fingers were cold, but they laced through mine with a desperate, certain strength. That night, he said, his eyes searching mine. Was that real? Yes, I said, my voice shaking. It was for me. It was for me, too, he said, a wave of relief washing over his features. Leo, I am so sorry. For being a coward. For making you wait. I'm new to this. All of this. It's terrifying. But the thought of not having it, of going back to how things were before, that's so much worse. He squeezed my hand. I don't want to go back. Tears I hadn't even realized I was holding back began to slide down my cheeks. He lifted his other hand and gently wiped them away with his thumb, his touch as soft and reverent as it had been by candlelight. Me neither, I choked out. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he stood up, still holding my hand, and tugged me gently to my feet. He led me out of my room, past the living room, and to the door of his own. He pushed it open and led me inside. His room was still messy, but it looked different now. It looked like his. He led me over to the cluttered bookshelf against the wall. He picked up a small stack of papers and moved them, clearing a space between a thick sports biography and a worn paperback novel. Then he looked at me. Which one? He asked softly. Which what? Your favorite book, he said. The one you're reading now. Go get it. Confused, I went back to my room and retrieved the book of poetry from my nightstand. When I returned, I handed it to him. He took it carefully, as if it were a priceless artifact. He looked at the cover, then at me, a small, hopeful smile playing on his lips. Then he placed it on his shelf in the space he had cleared. It looked small and out of place among his things, a little piece of my world, now sitting squarely in the middle of his. He turned back to me, his hands finding my waist, pulling me closer until our bodies were flush against each other. I want you in my space, he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. Not just as a roommate. I want you here, in my life, if you'll have me. The gesture was so simple, so profound it undid me. It wasn't just words. It was an action, an integration, a promise. He wasn't just accepting my world. He was inviting it into his. I wrapped my arms around his neck, burying my face in the crook of his shoulder. He smelled of the cold night air and sweat, and something that was just him. He held me tightly, his arms a strong, solid circle of reassurance. The walls I had so frantically rebuilt came crumbling down, not with a crash, but with a quiet, final surrender. The new beginning didn't dawn with a thunderclap. It arrived quietly in the small, domestic moments that followed. It was in the way we made coffee the next morning. Our bodies moved around each other in the small kitchen, a new, easy choreography replacing the old dance of avoidance. His hand brushed my back as he reached for a mug, a casual touch that sent a shiver of warmth through me. But this time, it was a warmth without anxiety. It was a warmth that felt like home. It was in the way he started leaving his bedroom door open. His music still bled into the hallway, but now it felt less like an intrusion and more like the soundtrack to our shared life. Sometimes I would look up from my book and see him in the doorway, just watching me, a soft, wondering smile on his face. His friends still came over, a loud, boisterous group of athletes who filled our small apartment with their energy. The first time it happened, my old fear flared up. I retreated to my room, ready to disappear. But Julian came and found me. He took my hand and led me out into the living room. "Everyone," he said, his voice clear and steady, silencing the chatter. "This is Leo." He didn't say my roommate, he just said my name. But his thumb was rubbing slow circles on the back of my hand, and the way he looked at me said everything else. There were a few surprised glances, a moment of awkward silence, and then one of the guys grinned and said, "Hey, Leo, you want a beer?" And just like that, the world shifted. I was no longer an outsider in my own home. I was a part of his world, and he was unashamedly, proudly a part of mine. The greatest change, however, happened at night. There was no more sleeping alone. We would end up in his bed, the sheets a tangle around us. Some nights, we talked for hours, filling in the gaps of the years we had lived side by side as strangers, discovering the people we had been hiding from each other. Other nights, we just held each other, the quiet comfort of his presence a balm to a loneliness I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Lying there, with his arm draped over me, his steady breathing a gentle rhythm in the dark, the frantic bird in my chest was finally, blessedly still. It wasn't caged. It was just at rest. One evening, weeks later, I was sitting in my usual armchair, reading. Julian was on the floor, leaning back against the couch, trying to untangle a set of headphones. The room was quiet, filled with a comfortable, lived-in peace. I looked up from my book and saw my olive green jacket slung over the back of a chair. He had worn it again a few days ago, without asking this time. He had just grabbed it on his way out, a simple domestic act of borrowing that felt more intimate than 1,000 kisses. I thought back to the person I was before that night, the quiet, fearful observer, content in his predictable orbit. My life had been a collection of straight lines and closed doors. I had believed that was safety. I had believed that was peace. Julian was a disruption, a meteor. He had crashed into my quiet world and knocked everything off its axis. He had taken my jacket, my shield, and in doing so, had forced me out from behind it. He had shown me a universe I was too afraid to even imagine, a universe where I didn't have to be alone. He looked up then and caught me watching him. He smiled that slow, devastating smile that still made my heart skip a beat. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "Just thinking. I didn't come to this university, to this apartment, looking for love. I came here looking for a quiet place to read my books and be invisible. But life, in its infinite and chaotic wisdom, gave me Julian instead. He wasn't a disruption to my life. He was the beginning of it. And it all started with a simple, stupid, life-changing question about a jacket. It turned out the thing I thought I needed to hide behind was actually the very thing that would lead me out into the open, into the warmth of a life I never knew I was brave enough to live."